Democracy was the rule of the mob, and actually many of the representatives decried democracy. And they said, this is a disease. We need to get rid of democracy for our republic. So therefore, they created a representative government, the first in the modern era. Today, we think about representative democracy in the United States and that constitution that allow for slavery, allow for Jim Crow, right? So it's not really a constitution that from the very beginning sets you free. We think about that as the cornerstone of democracy, as something sacred, but it's something that really was an organization of power created by the elite to reproduce their own power and resources to protect themselves. So this is a concrete example of how you can design a system, a set of rules that look general and look maybe democratic on the outside, but really work to reproduce this oligarchic power and to disempower the people.
Welcome everybody to the free podcast, Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. I'm Clara Mattei, and I'm your host. We are extremely excited today because we just launched our very first live event with the free last night, Friday, 23rd of August, with an incredible speaker, a speaker that could not best embody the spirit of free. This is Camila Vergara, a political theorist that can really help us understand how there's nothing neutral about economic dynamics and how politically encased our socioeconomic system is. We don't have a hard time understanding that the economy is not working for us, it's working for profit. In fact, for every $1 earned by the bottom 90% of the global population, each billionaire earns 1.7 million. The inequality is so staggering that in the United States, the 1% owns more than the 90% of the population combined. So this is how right now we really do need concepts that help us see through this economic violence and react positively in favor of social transformation. Camila, you have written a splendid book, Systemic Corruption, Ideas for an Anti-Oligarchic Republic. And this book really brings forward a very important conceptual toolbox that is very much something that liberals feel annoyed by, if we could say. The reason is because you expose how liberalism and democracy don't really work together, and how instead of just pointing the finger to the bad present of the moment or the corruption of one individual, we should understand corruption in a more systemic way. So that actually is part of how things work, not how things don't work. Can you explain to us a little bit about how your theoretical framework that you describe in your research can help us today understanding what's happening?
So thank you very much for the invitation to be able to speak to people about my work and how is it relevant to the economic welfare of individuals, not only here in Tulsa, but everywhere else. So part of my work is to actually to theorize how the system is rigged. We have this idea that there is an unfairness that is at the base of our system, that even if we work hard and do everything well, something can go wrong and basically we are left behind, crushed by debt, and basically we have no power to have any influence on the rules of the game that structure our work and daily life. So part of my aim is to understand that the structure is the Constitution itself, the rules of the game that are to blame for the individual precarity of people in a way, and a staggering inequality that you just conveyed between the few and the many. Of course, if we think about a democracy as a system in which the majority at least is in power, theoretically, we would understand that at least, the majority would be benefited by the rules rules of the game because they are influencing the rules of the game. However, if the 1% is appropriating 90% of the wealth that is collectively created, then of course the rules that regulate the exchanges and the accumulation of wealth is not really fair, right? It's skewed toward the few. And this is not a bug in the system, is really a feature. And this is part of the work that I have been trying to convey. And I go back to the organization of power in society. One of the first democracy, or at least abstractly a democracy, formally a democracy in the world, is the United States. So it's very interesting that we have the first modern democracy, which is also the most powerful economy in the world, and with the most powerful currency. In a way, there is an overlap. So it's a very interesting case study for us to see how inequality actually is structural and is reproduced, and is not a thing that goes wrong somewhere along the line. So part of the aim is to also desacralize, or kind of try to bring more details into the narratives that we are fed as citizens of a country. This story that is always 100% good, if you will, or we try to kind of smooth around the edges or get rid of the bad things in the narrative. And basically the few who are the ruling class have been creating and weaving this narrative from the very beginning. And today we are in a moment in which that narrative is breaking down. And therefore, we are more comfortable seeing the structural patterns of corruption. That is not a bad apple, some person that we can withdraw from power. It's not a piece of the system that we can reform and all will be fine. It is actually the system itself that was designed to basically reproduce the hierarchy and the accumulation of wealth of the few and protect the few from redistributive claims, from the people basically asking a fair share and having an effective demand on representative government. So from this perspective, I define today a system. Our democracy is an oligarchic democracy, a democracy that has been captured by the powerful few, and the people have really no power to influence government. And this is the product of a structural process that I call systemic corruption, that basically means the further accumulation of wealth and power in few hands, not against the law, but because of the law, because the law allows and the regulations allow for this enrichment legally, right? So this is basically the idea of systemic corruption, that the system is rigged, not individuals bringing the ruin to the system.
This is very important because economists tend to always make us think the opposite, make us think that ultimately this division of resources and of wealth is somehow a spontaneous, natural outcome of individual choices. So this is why it's so important to actually bring in a political theorist that is able to tell us how it's actually through the very constitutions that are at the foundation of the laws of our society that this structural detachment between the many and the few is created. Can you give us some concrete example of how the structural division between the many and the few who supposedly represent us in government comes about, and how our Constitution in the United States allows this to be? I do want to say that ultimately what we see today, which is that as the UN is ultimately calling out for a formal famine going on in Gaza, with ultimately over 500,000 people who are starving and dying because of man-made hunger. And with all this technology surveilling this famine, we have our government officials still blocking efforts to stop the military expenditures in favor of the genocide. So again, how these economic pressures from these lobbies in the industrial military complex are stronger than what people in the United States want, which is definitely not the slaughter and the starvation of children that we see on our phones. So this is a very good example, I think, of this structural distinction and division and conflict between what people want and what our representatives do. So can you give us a sense of how this happens in the Constitution of the United States?
Well, in the United States, as in everywhere else, the codes of law and the regulation is done at a moment of struggle. In general, are the winners who write down the rules when they have won the battles, in a way, the war. In the United States, it's not different. However, when there's a narrative that is created in this moment of founding, and then it is projected back and is smoothed out, and we lose the context in which the Constitution actually was made. Part of my teaching at Columbia and the pre-law program is teaching basically very young students about their own history, their own constitutional history, which is not really taught in schools. We start from the Constitution as a text and as a founding moment by these wise founders that are basically almost like mythical figures in a way. And we forget that there were people that were actually, the majority of them were moneylenders and real estate speculators and slave owners, right? Only a minority were people who didn't own slaves or had no interest in capital gains in a way. So we forget that, and that is not taught. So this is the beginning of the story. However, we need to go even back to see how that a constitution was not thought as a kind of foundation of a democratic republic, but actually was designed to keep the people away from power. So just after the War of Independence, we have a increasing debt of farmers, the yeoman farmers, who had fought in the War of Independence, have died, have lost limbs. Right? They went back to their farms after winning the war, and they were all depleted. All their crops were wasted, so they had to go into debt with the commercial elite in the coast to basically invest in their farms. They had a couple of bad years of crops with droughts, and at that point there was debtor's prison. So and citizenship, the active citizenship of basically the right to vote, was attached to property. You need to have an amount of property. So these veterans who had liberated the colonies from the British grip, they were now poor, in debt with the commercial elite. Many of them put in prison, and many of them lost their land. So they were basically disenfranchised and imprisoned just years after the War of Independence. So there was a group led by a general or a commander, Chase. And he basically is one of the leaders. However, it was a grassroots and a multiple state rebellion, not only one rebellion. And what happens is that these people actually were soldiers, right? They pick up arms again and they go to the courthouses and they burn down the courthouse where all the debt records were kept, so they could be free from this. And of course, this was after hundreds of letters of petition to Congress and to all the representative institutions, and nothing was basically being done. So in order to liberate themselves, they rebel. And this incident was so scandalous for the elite because basically people that owed money didn't want to pay it back.
What year is this, Camila?
This is 1789. I think 1776, just 1776, just before the writing of the Constitution, a few months earlier, basically, and it was quashed, and then the Pennsylvania Convention was self-appointed, as we know. These basically representatives select themselves and go there and discuss. The first vote that they passed was a vote of silence. So all of the people that wrote the Constitution bound themselves to censorship in order not to enrage, the popular sectors, because all this Constitution was about restraining the power that the people had collectively in order to impose redistributive demands. So the abolition of debt, right? The redistributive property. Later on in the 1890s, the nationalization of trains, for example, of railways. All these petitions that are common sense petitions when you are in, the working class of a society. However, all of the people that wrote the Constitution were part of the richest 10%. And they wrote a code that basically would accommodate a form of government that they said was better than democracy. Democracy was the rule of the mob. And actually, many of the representatives decried democracy. And they said, this is a disease. We need to get rid of democracy for our republic. So therefore, they created a representative government, the first in the modern era. And they sold that as democracy later, right? And at the beginning, democracy was a dirty word. But today, we think about representative democracy in the United States and that constitution that allow for slavery, allow for Jim Crow, right? So it's not really a constitution that from the very beginning sets you free. We think about that as the cornerstone of democracy, as something sacred, but it's something that really was an organization of power created by the elite to reproduce their own power and resources to protect themselves. So this is a concrete example of how you can design a system, a set of rules that look general and look maybe democratic on the outside, but really work to reproduce this oligarchic power and to disempower the people. We are the many. 90% of the population could crush the 1%, if you will. But we have bought into this narrative in which we need to preserve democracy and therefore preserve the system that we have. And that system that we have alienates us from power instead of empowering us.
And what can be like just something very specific? For example, the relation between us and those who we vote in office. How is it that ultimately just by the moment in which they get voted in, and of course they can be very, very enticing in their electoral agenda, how is it that once they get voted in, they ultimately get structurally detached and thus systemically corrupted? They can be the best people in the world. It's not them. It's them adapting to rules of the game that are far beyond their individual choice. How does that happen?
So on the one hand, there is the use of election, first of all. So election historically, and in how it is used in the different systems, is used to distinguish those among us that are the best among us, supposedly, right? The most qualified to rule. So immediately you are detached from the many. You're better than them in a way because you are receiving these votes from people. And that electoral authority, in a way, is something that is constructed. Not because people vote for you means that you're really better, right? But people really believe that they have been selected to rule, right? First of all, so it's a psychological detachment from the base. Yeah. Then you have a material detachment because the moment that you become a public servant, you immediately have a 4-year or 6-year, whatever your period is, that you are assured for all those times to receive a paycheck that puts you for materially in the richest 10% of the population. In every country in the world, except for Finland and some of the Nordic countries that have a very strict a kind of a touching point of the salaries with the minimum wage. Here in the United States, you earn 6 figures immediately. You get into, a federal office, right? So you immediately become the elite. It doesn't matter where you come from. You are immediately detached from all these votes, so you feel selected. Then you are earning this money that you didn't earn before if you were part of the working classes. You have an entourage. You have, your people working for you. People revere you. They treat you with, pronouns and things that are, that denote authority. And then basically you think that your base really is not in control of you. Because those 4 years that you get, you're really insulated from those demands. And if we think about our daily lives, who has the assurance that you're going to be for 4 years in a job without being fired? So the minimal thing that we could do to actually regain control is have recall elections. This is something that was a petition, actually, from the People's Party in the 1890s in the United States, a very progressive party, the first populist party, modern populist party of the world. And they were asking, first of all, for recall elections. They were asking for nationalization of the railways. They were against, the creditor class, as they call it, the plutocracy. So there is always, I think, in the United States history, a push for redefining terms and for pushing for more democracy from below and not for this insulation of the representatives. Really, the political class becomes the oligarchy really governing and ruling the country.
Very interesting. Question I have is the fact that ultimately we know that any of our elected representatives in the United States immediately from day one are trying to fundraise for their next elections. And so ultimately how if the people don't count those who vote for them, who counts as those who lend the money for them to run in the first place. And we know that this has been incredibly strong in order to censor elected officials against the genocide. To actually lose their position, and because ultimately where the money stands is the money that profits from eternal war. Is this it was not, I imagine, in the founding constitution? Is this a practice that occurred later? Where is the fact that you need a lot of money to run for election in the first place? When does this come into the picture? And how does this even further enhance this detachment that you're describing in terms of then our representatives have to actually cater to those who have that money rather than those who are actually electing them for their agenda?
So at the beginning, campaign finance, as we know it, was illegal. Of course, giving money to politicians is always with some string attached. So therefore, it's corruption. You're trying to influence them, and your influence will be greater the more money you give. So of course, it is corruption. It's common sense, right?
But is it systemic corruption or is it corruption?
So that is an institutional form of corruption because you have a system, an electoral system, which is a kind of a subsystem of the whole, right? That runs in a manner that is not really that is not fulfilling its purpose as a moral or, a bigger, higher purpose, which is, for example, electoral systems is to elect the best among us, really, the people that are going to rule for the good of everyone. However, elections from day one have been basically selecting the people that have more money and more donors. So even if campaign finance was illegal, this campaign finance that we know kind of informal was happening from the very beginning, right? And we see that in the 19th century, the US was one of, the corrupt governments. We need to just watch, the films that come out of that period in a way, the kind of clientelism and the mafia around governors, because of course we know that the people that we elect, they have the key to all the regulation that will affect your business, your accumulation of wealth. So therefore, from the beginning, if you have elected office, you immediately try to influence that office. One thing that is interesting to note is that in political science, and here talking about academia and the role of academia in reproducing this idea that representative government is democracy and is the best system that we have, and there's no other in a way, is that elections are thought as a mode of accountability. So the reason at the beginning of the mid 20th century, but with force on the 1990s, like really with a lot of force, is that frequent elections are very good for the system because it allows for rotation in office and for people to basically vote out of office people that are bad. Like in theory, it sounds great. You can just every 4 years you vote out, right? And then someone better comes in and you can clean up, the basket of apples from the rotten ones and you don't go on. However, the system works in which individuals are not really relevant, are parties which are relevant. So when you have a system in which you have only two parties and you, in order to win office, you need to be part of that machinery, then it doesn't matter who is elected. It matters that it's one of those two parties, and those two parties keep ruling and being detached from the people. So at the end, the most frequent elections allow for even more corruption because you have more money into the system and you have representatives that from day one, instead of doing their job, they need to fundraise in order to be reelected. So in a way, if you're not going to have rotation and going to be reelected. So it is sabotaged from the very beginning.
They only pick up the calls from their donors rather than from their constituency. So this is a very, very sad truth. So Camila, how can we react to this? How is it that once we understand how systemic corruption operates and the deep connection between the rules of the game at once that are political and economic and how they operate against us, what can we do about this? What has happened in the past? I know you're now researching on ways in which the power from below has manifested in demands to expropriate the oligarchs in power. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? And then I want to tell the audience that we are getting into the nitty-gritty of what we can actually do with the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation itself, starting from Tulsa, but going global. So but let's start a little bit with some history of success stories about how the rules of the game can shift. They're not made in heaven, so organization might work.
Yes. So part of my work is actually to go and see where, we have had popular power organized and effective in a way, and how popular power can keep actually oligarchy in check. You're never going to be able to eliminate oligarchy. And this is part of the detachment of the leadership from the rank and file, even in unions, even in very grassroots organizations. Leaders, they accumulate power, they accumulate know-how, right? They accumulate connections. So in a way, they are different from the rank and file. And then after a few years, they really believe that post is theirs to have, right? So that is like natural. It's not something that we can really eliminate. We need to deal with it. And in order to deal with it, we need to be empowered, because the oligarchs, the elite, always have more power. They have more material resources, and therefore they have more opportunities to connect to one another and to influence the police and, government itself and the rules of the game. So therefore, the people need to be really empowered. So part of my work is to actually go and see where in history we, the people, were organized enough, in a way, and effectively to actually check that power and be free, right? And constantly be free, because it's not something that we think about it, having a constitution that is a democracy and we're done and we drop the mic and we live in a free society. We know that is not how it works, right? We have today, a permanent residents and even citizens being snatched from the street to put in detention centers because of immigration rates. So we know that freedom is not something that you conquer and then you're done with it. It's something that you really need to keep up constantly. So part of the kind of like the historical lessons is that is the way that people need to be activated and need to have power enough in order to keep the representatives in check constantly, not once every 4 years and not through elections, right? One of those cases is the Roman Republic. So we had two basically popular governments in antiquity. One is ancient Greece with, Athens democracy, and the other is Republican Rome. While in Athens, there was a single assembly that had kind of working groups within, and people rotated in the making decisions. But, the working class was included and was paid actually to exercise power within. There was no division between the few and the many within the assembly. And what happened is that the elite, being more prepared, being more rhetorically effective, they would command the assembly, basically, and would sway the vote. And some people voted against their own interests, because this is how it is when you don't have that kind of separation. The Roman Republic was very different. You had the Senate as the key and the seat of aristocratic power. So senators were appointed and were for life in a way. They were a family hereditary in a way, and they controlled the finances of the republic. The people, the plebeians, so the people with no last name in a way, with no pedigree, they had their own quarter in the Roman Republic, a territorial space that they basically controlled, the plebeian quarter, and they had their own plebeian assembly in which laws were passed. And those laws at the beginning were only binding for the plebeians, so they passed laws for themselves. But after the 4th century with Lex Hortensia, they basically started being binding for the whole republic. So imagine, we have the working classes of Rome passing what they were called the plebiscites, because they were laws that started from the plebs. And they were binding for the whole republic, that they could bind the aristocracy. They could actually pass law from below and control the wealthy. A lot of sumptuary laws were passed against luxury, for example, in the last part of the republic. And they also had this, assembly, and they had their own representatives, the tribunes. the tribunes of the plebs. And they were basically delegates. They were not representatives as we understand them. They were 10 of them selected by the plebs of the assembly, and they were basically carrying the laws that were passed in the council and making them binding in the whole republic. So one of the first, we could say, populist economic policy making through law, okay, it was the agrarian reform by Tiberius Gracchus in the last century of the Republic, in the late Republic. This tribune basically was from the aristocracy, was a noble in a way, that was a popularis, was very close to the people, and he was selected as one of the tribunes. And after there was war and there was a lot of loot that was appropriated by the elites, the people were poor, and they were saying to him, we have fought for the Republic, again the same as in the Roman Republic, in the United States, in which the veterans that had fought for Rome came back to their houses and they had nothing in a way, and they were poor. So they demanded that at least the territories that they had conquered, at least part of it went to the plebs, and this actually was the law. Tiberius Gracchus goes, and after a whole ordeal, he passes a law with the support of the assembly for expropriating land that was illegally appropriated by the elite. So imagine, you go to war, you colonize a part of the territory, and instead of giving it to the soldiers, which was the law at the time, you needed to redistribute to the plebs, the elite would occupy it. And because it was not that this law of redistribution was not enforced, they basically occupied the land for 100 years. So of course, anyone occupying land for 100 years, they think that is theirs, even if they don't have the title for it, right? So the oligarchy thought that it was their land, and they thought that expropriation, which was to just enforce the law that was before, was illegal, and therefore they wanted to kill, Tiberius. Tiberius, this law basically wanted to expropriate this land without compensation. And this is the crucial part. Because when we think about today of nationalizing or making companies public again, we think about the state having to pay back, basically, the company. It's not just taking away the company, they pay back. And the problem is that those companies are so expensive, or the land is so expensive, that you as a state cannot really do that, because, you are, in certain, regulations that in terms of, trade agreements or other agreements, that you cannot do that. So that push for redistribution was killed in that moment with Tiberius Gracchus, that was assassinated by a mob of the senators. So not even some mercenaries, it was actually the senators who stabbed him to death because he was a class traitor, right? And then this is another, push for the same kind of economic populism was with Salvador Allende in Chile.
Camila, sorry, did the law stay in place? Were they actually able to expropriate the oligarchs, or did the law not actually come to fruition?
So the law was passed. Then there was an institution that was created to actually, enforce the law and redistribute. Tiberius was part of that kind of institution. And of course, as a tactic that we know is very common today, the Senate defunded the institution. So they could not actually properly redistribute. So they actually started the redistribution. And when they started to expropriate without compensation, then is when he's killed. And then basically that was the first time in the Roman Republic's history that a political, economic issue was resolved by violence. And then after that, basically, the Roman Republic was full of violence, and then ended up in empire, right? So this was the first part, and that, of course, law was never enforced.
So it's really interesting, because even if the reaction is always present and ready to take back the power, these four wins, even if temporary, open up political imagination for what is possible, and again, what is natural. And the idea that we're saying we expropriate without compensation really questions the idea that private property in itself, especially of land, of goods, that could be otherwise a commons, a space that everyone can access and live off of, is indeed something sacred that we have to accept. So I guess now moving on, I know your other two examples come from a more capitalist period. And how does this help, again, open imagination and question those kind of pillars that we take for granted, again, as coming from heaven? And instead, we can start realizing that they are deeply political choices that we can question.
Well, before going into the second example, what you just said about, private property being, this pillar and sacred in our society is really bringing us to an absurd point in which companies can be owners of part of the earth or the ocean. How can we own something that is not really ours in the sense that is common and is nature in a way? And we're part of nature. We have separated ourselves from nature in this manner that we can own it, extract it, destroy it, and not really understand that we're all connected. So we're all dying in a way instead of flourishing when we put property at the center as a sacred right in a way, as liberalism puts it, right? John Locke famously, the father of liberalism, theorized all rights as property rights. Because for him, if you didn't have property, you couldn't live. So therefore, the right to life is equal to the right to property.
And I think what's really interesting is that Marx notes the paradox of what Locke is saying, because indeed, Locke is actually justifying property through labor, saying, actually, if you put labor into a natural object, say you cut the tree, then that labor is what entitles you to the property of that wood. And what is very fascinating under capitalism is that actually those who put in the labor are those who never get to keep the value and the wealth. So it's actually not even that's the whole point, is that actually those who own property are rarely those who actually do the work. And thus the justification for private property, even under the liberal criterion, falls historically. And I guess Salvador Allende came into power supported by a base exactly on this point. The workers were getting expropriated by big multinational companies from the United States, from the global north, while nothing was left to them.
Yes, and for those of you who don't know, Chile is a producer of copper. Almost 70% of our production of our GDP basically comes from copper at that point in the 1970s, and therefore Allende campaigned to nationalize copper. So the majority of the industries of copper were owned by U.S. companies at that point, 1970, right? And Allende won the presidency, and with one of the, the biggest push for him was the nationalization of copper. And he understood nationalization not as expropriation, in the sense that you expropriate individuals of their, property for something specific. For him, nationalizing was following the UN resolution that had just passed about resource sovereignty. The idea that the countries have complete sovereignty, complete control in a way over their natural resources, and that therefore cannot be really private property as we understand it as sacred, because then sovereignty would be a sham. Right. So as a country, you need to decide what to do without being crippled by private industry in a way. And so Allende wanted to expropriate the companies, the transnational copper companies, but he wanted to do it within this kind of new framework of nationalization. And he, of course, didn't want to pay them back. Because how is it? It's absurd that you need to pay them back for something that is not even theirs. The mineral is not theirs. They have invested in infrastructure, sure, but the mineral is not theirs. So in a way, the mountain is not theirs. And they have been exploiting for so long. So Allende had this very clever way of circumventing, the capitalist legality, and was to say, okay, yes, we nationalize it. We're going to pay you. We're going to compensate you. We're going to abide by the law. However, in that compensation, we need to take into account the excessive production and expropriation of the resources that you have done during the last 15 years that you have been in operation. So it was calculated based on an average return that was acceptable And therefore, it was so different from the average return that they had that at the end of the kind of a judicial procedure, it was determined that these companies owed Chile, that state, the state, millions of dollars. So it was the other way around, and this was, condemned. It was, well received in the sense that in Chile it was unanimous. It was this nationalization occurred through a constituent amendment that was voted unanimously in both houses in Congress. So you had the oligarchy also on board because we understood that that was a national resource. So at the end, in a way, in this kind of struggle between capital and, the nation, in a sense of like we're all together in the same boat, the nation of Chile won. And one of the examples that we can see is, or the evidence is that Pinochet also didn't denationalize it, didn't give it back in a way, because it was so much money in a way. And it's so, is something that it was so in the narrative of our kind of nationalism, our copper, which Allende said in the slogan was, it is the salary of Chile. It's our, wage in a way of all Chileans. So of course we know of history that, there was a coup organized and backed by the CIA and the local oligarchy that couldn't basically bear this. And they committed, war crimes in that moment. They were as a civil war. They were disappearing people, torturing people, just to stop this kind of taking over and socializing of the economy through the ballot box and through kind of peaceful means and not weapons. Because we need to remember that the Cuban Revolution had happened, and also kind of Nicaragua and Guatemala and other places in which there was a revolutionary spirit that the U.S. wanted to counteract. And Allende had won the presidency through the vote and was there to make a revolution without weapons.
That's really interesting. Just for the audience, we're talking about 1970 when Allende was elected and September 11, 1973, when La Casa de la Moneda was actually burnt down by the military supported by the United States to back a new regime that was not favorable to nationalization, but rather to privatization on a large scale. It's interesting. I didn't know that copper survived, but we know that everything else, and still today, Chile is run by private corporations like, of course, the United States and the majority of the countries today. So the last example brings us kind of to the present moment and what happened in South Africa.
Yeah, this is a very interesting and very timely topic, because basically we have in South Africa, after apartheid, you have this transition period in which you have one of the first constitutions in the world which has the right to housing and the right to health, this kind of socioeconomic rights written in. So South Africa is part of what we called the transformative constitutionalism. Colombia, Brazil are also part of it. And there was a lot of hope in materializing these rights. 90% of the land in, the South Africa was owned by the white minority, which is like 9% of the population or something like that. And there was in place this right and actually, other policy to be able to redistribute that land and have the black majority also, be landowners and be able to live off the land and have a house and all these things. However, today, the redistribution has been less than 2%. So nothing has changed. Even if we have this transformative constitutionalism, we have, a favorable, pro-people government. We have all the kind of infrastructure for it to happen. It didn't. So now we have a group, a political party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, who basically have been pushing for a new law for expropriation of land without compensation. And finally, they were able to pass it. A few months ago, there was already basically being signed as law. And this triggered, it was very interesting, this triggered this narrative of the white genocide in South Africa. So the idea, and here we connect again with the liberalism, right? If private property is equal to the right to life, as Locke says and the liberal ideology says, if you are going to take the property away, you are taking life away. So therefore, the white minority who is part of the oligarchic class, and in the majority of the white population in South Africa are the wealthy part of the population. They are being expropriated at a very small rate. Okay, so it's not like some drastic thing, and they're not being compensated. This is being read the same as genocide, and therefore Trump understands this, that we need to have these immigrants here because they're taking their land away. And again, we have this parallel with, West Bank and Gaza itself, that they want to basically parcel it out, right? So we have this, on the one hand, a progressive push for expropriating land that has been illegally appropriated by a minority that has been oppressive, right? And without compensation, so the state actually can do it. And on the other hand, we have a colonizer state, which is taking away land from people illegally and making a profit out of it. So there's like these two movements about land and about resources and about rare minerals and all this, Greenland and all this, Trump that wants to invade Mexico. And there is a push for colonizing and the new frontier. And there is this, pushback, I think, from, the economic freedom fighters, but other people in Latin America, that they want to push for expropriation without compensation, because this is not only about land, but also about water. So in Mexico, they tried to nationalize water. And they couldn't, because basically it was so expensive to pay back the companies that they couldn't do it. And today we are thinking about, the rule of law and the Constitution. What actually matters are the trade agreements. The trade agreements are made by corporations for their mutual assurance that their profit and their investment is protected. So therefore, they say, well, if you're going to nationalize it and you're going to change the rules of the game and you're going to give me a more stringent regulation about environment, you're going to hurt my profits, and that is damaging for me. So you need to compensate me. And that means that the countries in the global south cannot really do public policy that is for the people without basically transgressing the trade agreements and being shunned by the international community.
Camila, thank you for your powerful words. Two reactions. One is on the tragic way in which the global elite uses a term like genocide that is codified by the Geneva Convention and by the UN, and to tell us that it is actually the intentional elimination of an entire ethnic group or national group. And ultimately, the starvation of the children in Gaza are a very strong example of this, with the conflation with the protection of the property of the oligarchy. So this is ultimately, I think, very important. Is the term genocide is so important historically to demarcate what have been the extreme violence in our capitalist history. But the idea that we can just use this word so easily ultimately is part of how then we normalize these excesses of violence. But it's very important to note again how they are weaponized to protect the colonizers, both in apartheid Africa, that remains apartheid because of this economic division, and the starvation of children in apartheid Africa because of this extreme poverty there. One of the most unequal country in the world, South Africa. And related to this, I wanted to point out a data point that I've been wanting to share with the audience for a while, which is that actually, last point you mentioned, the Africa and the global south are actually net creditors to the rest of the world. It goes exactly to what you were saying about Pinochet, making the calculation and saying, hey, you copper multinational, you owe us money. And right now we have new data points from actually the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst that tells us that over the decades, 30 sub-Saharan African countries have lost more than 2 trillion to capital flight, which is almost the annual gross domestic product of sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so in 2015 alone, African country received 162 billion, mainly in loans, aid, and personal remittances. But in the same year, 203 billion was taken from the continent, either directly through capital flight or when multinational repatriate profits to their home countries, or indirectly through the payment of interest on loans. So also this narrative that we are trying to construct here really looks at the world completely in the reverse to the mainstream. It's not Africa who is getting our money and we're being so nice to, pay back our colonial times. We are actually constantly expropriating. And the idea of saying that we can actually expropriate without compensation is very important, because the very word expropriation takes on a different meaning. They have expropriated us for all these years. We are simply asking for a form of economic justice that though requires political organization, because we know, as you have just told us, that the systemic corruption of our rules of the game in place are definitely not going to allow for such radical redistribution of resources in the hands of the many. This is where I would like you to bring us back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we have our Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. This afternoon, we have the luck of having you with us in our first organized assembly to discuss our charter and our bylaws, because it is indeed from the local that we can organize to breach this imagination and to take back the narrative that we need to stand up. So what can we do with free, and how can we organize free through a charter that is indeed able to overcome the systemic corruption that is present in so many other constitutions in this world?
So first of all, I'm very excited about the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. I think there is a real need to redefine economics based on lived experience and material conditions on the ground, on the different contexts, on the different experiences of communities, and this sense of exploitation that is lingering among all of us in a way. And it's necessary to bring the kind of macro lens and understand that this is a structural issue and not really an individual failure. And this is how people, live their lives. They get, fired from their employment, or they get into debt for some reason. Is always kind of a individual failure, and we need to pick ourselves up from the bootstraps. And this idea is just wrong in the sense that it is the structure which is built this way, right? And therefore we need to first acknowledge that the structure is built this way, so we understand what are these rules of the game and how can we hack them, right? Because we cannot just change the rules, in the sense that if we try to expropriate without compensation, for example, in here or Chile or anywhere else in which the right to property is a constitutional right, you will end up with Supreme Court saying, this is unconstitutional. You really cannot do this. You need to pay basically the person, because property is recognized. However, if we think about property as something, especially, Oklahoma or places where, the West, there was never property to begin with. There was no exchange. There was taking of land. There was common land, right? So there is this, I think, parallel that we need to kind of be very careful not to conflate, that we cannot empower ourselves locally just to be like the elite. So the people have a different way of organizing and a different way of, managing affairs, relating. And academia and other, spheres in which there is intellectual hierarchy, there is, expertise. There are different spheres. And I think Free is trying to combine these two, this kind of popular wisdom and, self-governance and the imagination that comes from the lack of limits. Because when we are in academia or we are in politics or, lawmaking or, any profession that we really need to learn the rules of the game by heart, we are constrained by those rules. It's very difficult for us to step out of those rules. We need to think about realistically. However, what is realistic is not really in favor of the welfare of the people. And this is the reality. Realistic is oligarchic,
yes.
And that is a way of kind of cutting our wings. And when we are in the system and talking about academia, how academia is really reproducing in many ways the oligarchic structure by providing theoretical justification for the system, for providing these pillars in a way that sound very lofty, but at the end is just, a reproduction of bare oligarchy, right? So we need to step out of that. And how do we do that? By connecting to the real world. Academics are almost never in the real world. So this enterprise of bringing basically community-based organization and wisdom and energy with an intellectual community that is thirsty for real economics in a way and for real data points and not just like some macroeconomic index that we don't really know what are the people behind it, but actually real lived experience is there when basically academia and popular power meet. And that could be super powerful. And I think this initiative by the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation is really the starting point for something like that, a real innovation in terms of praxis, a word that was used by, in leftist circles, and it was in vogue for a little while, and then was dropped because it was too difficult. And I think today is imperative that we go back to praxis, to the idea that basically there is principles and values that come out of popular activity, of activity that is collective, and those principles need to be understood and basically theorized and taxonomized by intellectuals and then brought back to the people to another iteration, instead of academia really reading books and looking at the macro and then imposing principles of how you should be organizing or you should be doing democracy and then imposing it on the people and labeling that participation, right? So in a way, I think the iteration of something that is born in the bottom goes to the experts and then goes back for approval in the bottom. This is a system in which systemic corruption or the separation between the commons and the elite, which is the intellectual elite, is basically averted. You can bring them back by forcing them to basically reconcile with you, right? Be with you. So this idea of co-creating an agenda that is a research agenda that is basically guided by the people, led by the people, and the intellectuals can theorize from that. That is really praxis, and that is what the free is all about. So I think if we can put that in rules of the game and give the assembly of commons, of common members in a way, the power to decide the agenda, to see what is important to them in the reality of their daily lives, and then basically empower them with, a budget that they don't have, that we can channel, as academics, as grants, because it's all of the topics are interesting. It's important that they decide which ones. And there's an agenda of outreach that you need to grow and you need to, be able to touch others with your teachings and your activity to energize the people to do projects. And of course, we cannot really change the law from the local setting, but we can actually create counter-hegemonic spaces in which the logic of separation of elections, of hierarchy, of profit, of individual ownership is eliminated. And we can actually create spaces that are common, that are prefiguration of what society could be, that we are actualizing a mode of being in this space that is a solidarity space and that makes it real for the first time. We do not act as solidarity people in a way. We're not agents of solidarity. We are actually agents of egoism in this society. So if we are able to construct these spaces of learning and activity that are counter-hegemonic, that are against this logic, this is already a form of power that we can scale up.
Yes. And everyone gains from this. Gramsci, in speaking about Praxis, talked about the democratic philosopher. The idea that the content of reflection, what was actually possible content with innovative ideas, with concepts that could actually empower, break away from the ideology that is so powerful. For example, the idea, again, that the market is spontaneous, that the state is separate from the market, that if we are poor, we deserve it. All of these concepts require counter-concept, counter-hegemonic concepts that can only, though, come if those who theorize are actually participant in the assembly, in the group, with the comrades, with the people, with the others in the society. And this is something that I think is very sad for academics, because having been removed structurally from participation in social struggles, their theory is empty. They keep repeating the same stuff over and over for decades and decades and are not capable of reading the present moment. And the violence of the present moment requires instead some knowledge that is able to break free by joining Free, by joining our forum. And I think this is very interesting. So I know we are discussing the bylaws today, but also the idea of having a board that is half elected by the assembly and half part of members that are academics that the assembly approves of, and we really hope you can be one of these members we will discuss today, I think gives this sense that division of labor is important, but it can't not be divided. It's just labor that is complementary, but has to be integrated very, very organically. I want to ask you this, though, to finish up. We are ultimately, our entry point is public education, knowledge, and involvement. And last night proved how actually art and the capacity to channel knowledge also through aestheticism, participation of local artists with their wonderful talent is very important to create the sense of community that is the starting point. But ultimately, I hope that Free becomes more than just public education, how public education, again, can become meaningful if connected with actual experiments to take back resources from food to energy to really everything that makes our life human rather than precarious and market dependent. So what do you see as potential economic battles that Free could undertake as part of its agenda to make real what we are ultimately in discussion about?
So one of the, I think, that is important because it is the base of everything is the democratic process. So one of the things that Free can do in its actual existence is to foster this democratic deliberation and the ways of engaging in a way with the community. Because and this is something that the philosopher Hannah Arendt, was famous for, basically saying and being in favor of collective wisdom and this idea of bringing people together into a space just to talk about the life in common and what do we want. And this is for her the source of politics. Core politics is just basically people getting together and trying to, define life in common. And if we can do that, miracles can happen in a way, in the sense that miracles that are not realistic, in the sense that things and projects can be initiated from that space of imagination and dialogue. And we need to, relearn. If we think about, epigenetics, maybe back in the day, we were all assembly-based in a way, right? As we know, in indigenous peoples and, history books reveal that hierarchy starts in some civilizations, but it's not really natural to humans in a way. Cooperations is also very natural to humans. But we have lost that in this neoliberal era. So I think the forum, bringing together art, bringing together music, every expression that is not really for profit, anything that is brings people together in a more holistic manner, touching in all, not only logic, not only numbers, not only data points, but actually the connection with the soul, right? With empathy, with something that moves us from another level. We know that we can hear some music sometimes and we get goosebumps and we get really moved and we don't really know why, but it happens. So this is what we need to aim, not only at moving people with ideas, but with this energy that we can only create collectively. So it's not that you're watching something online, you need to be participating. So I think the forum as a space could foster this initial kind of how to make assembly-based politics and projects, right, and make it work. And on the other hand, because, Free is a forum that is connected to, budgets and donors and the other, part that is more, part of the hierarchy is a form of interface in a way. It's a way of channeling the philanthropy in a way to actual projects on the ground. So when you think about having, for example, a community or a commons, a place that could be just wasted, instead of owning it, one person, the community can own it in a way and make a cooperative and make something with it and for it and make that space a space of counter-hegemonic politics in a way. So I think the forum is the beginning of something that could be very impactful. First, because it is assembly-based and allows us to learn how to be political, because we don't know. We need to learn how to respect, how to keep it concise, how to be constructive. All these things are learned, and we need to do it. And that we can only do it by doing it. So in a way, Free is the place.
Yes, I want to refer back to a question from last night of one of our assembly members, Sam, who mentioned the fact that we ultimately are conflicting with one another because we have been socialized in this liberal form that makes us individuals in antagonism, petty and capable of gossip and putting ourselves before the project. I guess the point about free is actually really to learn how to re-socialize ourselves in these collective spaces. And again, it's an entry point. And hopefully this entry point will make us think bigger and think in a way that can involve the community in Tulsa, but also at a more global level, inspire other chapters of a similar effort. Thank you, Camila, for being with us. You make me so happy. It's such a pleasure. We're so honored. And we really hope to continue working with you in every way possible. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and the best for the free.